While I was sitting here waiting for class to start, it occurred to me that I've been starting all my classes saying, I hope you all had a great long weekend. I didn't realize it was Wednesday, so that was more of a yesterday kind of statement, but I guess that just goes to show us where we're at right now. So for today's lecture, we're going to start with Chapter 2. And the textbook has given it a very lofty sounding title, which is The Research Enterprise in Psychology, which is, I think, their fancy way of saying that we're going to be talking about research methods, and specifically psychological research methods. I just found it kind of funny that they made it sound that formal when most textbooks will just call this chapter methods, and sometimes nothing else. But as sort of a connection from last week's lectures into this new topic, we had started with that concept of rationalism versus empiricism. And we had said that rationalism was that idea that knowledge can be obtained through reason. So when we had all of those philosophers who sat around and thought about things, that was rationalism. But we had argued that that isn't quite as scientific as we might like in a scientific field. And that's when we started moving away from rationalism towards the concept of empiricism. And this is the idea that knowledge can be obtained through observation and experience. So we learn about our environment, we change our behavior based on the things that we encounter, the things that we experience as we go about our lives. And so that observation and experience idea actually carries us through into this idea of the scientific method. So most of the scientific method is going to deal with empirical methods, is I guess the best way to say it. So when we talk about the purpose of research, when we're trying to look at what it is that we're studying with our research, there are three broad categories that we can break it down into. And this is specific to psychology, but I think it can also apply to other fields. So here we have three general goals, and any particular research study can try and answer one or more of these potential goals. So the first of these is the idea of measurement and description. So maybe you've noticed that there is a particular phenomenon going on campus. You notice that people tend to wear a particular color on a particular day. So you would like to measure and describe that occurrence. Maybe you want to count the number of students wearing that particular color. We're getting close to Halloween, so maybe you're watching how many students are wearing orange and black or something like that. So you might want to get an absolute measurement, or maybe you'd like to give a proportion. Maybe 10% of students are wearing those colors. So that would be our first goal, where you're giving some kind of description of what you measured from your sample. Our second potential goal is understanding and prediction. So not only do you want to describe what's happening, but you want to understand why it's happening. And once you understand why, you can start to predict what might happen, start changing things around. So maybe people are wearing orange, and you want to know if it's because they're going to a very early Halloween party or because of something else. So maybe you look for flyers advertising for Halloween parties. And then maybe if you think that I've found enough flyers, it's probably for parties, well, maybe you see if I have my own party, if I put up more flyers, do more people wear orange? Or whatever. These are off the top of my head examples, and they're not always great. But by starting to do some manipulations, you can actually get some predictions about why things are happening, and you can get a little bit of evidence that shows you that, yeah, your why was probably right. And then the last of our potential goals is for application and control. So once you understand why a particular behavior is happening, maybe now you want to use that knowledge to make it happen more or less often. Maybe you hate the color orange, so you don't want it to be around you. So maybe you take down all the flyers or whatever. And these can be applied to far more scientific pursuits. but it's just what I came up with off the top of my head. And like I said, a particular study can look at one or all of these. It just depends on what the scope is. So some of the research that I've done, we have a basic description of something that chickadees do, but we don't know why they do it. So most of my research would fall under number 2. I'd like to understand and be able to predict their behavior. So that's the kind of research that I do. But some people will start at, we want to measure it and go all the way to controlling it. And some start at the end because other people have done the earlier stages. It all depends on what you're looking at. So next, we're going to look at specifically the scientific method. And I've been giving a little bit of a disclaimer on this slide, and that's because every single science class that I've ever seen talk about the scientific method has a different way of breaking down the scientific method. Even though the process is fairly consistent, whether you're looking at psychology or biology or whatever, different texts tend to break it down differently. And out of curiosity, I checked all of the intro psych texts that I have at home, and I have 4 of them, and not 2 ended up overlapping. They all have different breakdowns of the scientific method. They all follow the same process, but when they have these numbered steps like this, they don't match. So that's my long-winded way of saying that you may have seen the scientific method with a different breakdown, and that is perfectly fine and probably more likely. So don't panic if it's a little bit different. That also being said, based on the way that I like to test things, I won't ask you something mean like, what is step 4 of the scientific method? What I'd prefer to focus on is the process. So if I gave you a list of events, could you put them in the right order according to this process? Or if I described a situation where someone was following the scientific method, could you identify that it was the scientific method, as opposed to being able to divide it up into the right numbers? That's a little bit less important because it isn't consistent across sources. So just a little bit of a disclaimer there. Now, despite that, we are going to follow the numbers just because the order is the process. So we're going to start at the beginning. Number 1 for this book, which is you start by formulating a testable hypothesis. Technically, you should have some kind of general observation that you've made or some kind of idea that you want to ask a question about in mind before you make a hypothesis, but that's sort of assumed here. So we'll talk more in depth when we get into the section on experiments about the difference between a hypothesis and a theory. But for here, when we're talking about a hypothesis, we're talking about a specific prediction, something that we can test by doing an experiment of some kind. So here, when we're formulating a testable hypothesis, we're going to make up some kind of prediction of what would happen if things exist in the world a certain way. So I've used the example of maybe you want to see if a poster is an effective form of advertisement for getting people excited for an upcoming event. So our hypothesis would be that seeing our poster should make people more excited. So that's what we're going to go through the example here with. So our basic hypothesis actually gives us some ideas of our next step. The next step being that we have to choose a research method and a design. So we need to decide, this is the question that we're asking. How are we going to ask it, and how are we going to answer it? So this is where we start thinking about, what are we going to measure? What are we going to manipulate? What are we going to change? Who are we testing this in? All of these questions get answered at number 2 here. So from our example, we want to show people a poster and we want to measure their excitement level seeing that poster. Okay, so we're at a university, we'll probably just use undergrads. Maybe we're really lucky, we'll get into the psych undergrad pool, and we'll get a bunch of undergrads to come into our lab and we'll show them the advertisement on a computer screen. Everything's nice and controlled that way. For excitement levels, maybe we'll measure their heart rate. And we want to compare that to something. We can't just look at their heart rate and say it's high, it's high compared to what? So when you're doing an experiment, you're usually going to have a comparison group. So we can do this a couple of different ways. Maybe we can measure the participants' heart rate before they see the advertisement and after the advertisement. Or maybe we want to do it a little bit differently. Maybe we want to have one group that sees the advertisement and one group that sees an unrelated neutral image. We'll show them a tree. And then we can measure both groups' heart rates to see if the experimental group, the one that saw our advertisement, has a higher heart rate than those in the control group who saw the neutral image. So, and we could do a combination of those. We could measure both groups before and after being exposed to the image, and having it sort of multiple levels. Sometimes it's better to go that way, especially working with humans, because, as we've said before, humans are difficult to study and things very rarely go as you plan. So having multiple methods is sometimes useful if you can manage. So, all right, that seems like a pretty sound design. We've decided what we're measuring, we've decided how we're measuring it, we've decided who we're going to measure it in. Perfect. Then we can move on to the next step, which is actually collecting the data. And this is kind of a deceptively simple step. It's 3 words, but this can take days, months, years, even decades. If you're doing something like a longitudinal study, which is where you follow people throughout their lives to test different levels as they age, you can be doing this for decades across their entire lifetime. So collecting data isn't necessarily as simple as it might appear from this statement here, but they do hand wave that because we will spend some time talking about different data collection methods in just a couple of slides. So we hand wave the fact that magically we now have data. So we will have measured and registered their heart rates before and after seeing either the advertisement or the tree, and we have our data. So now we can take what we've collected and we can analyze that data to draw conclusions. So this is the part where statistics would happen. And you might have noticed if you glanced ahead in the slides that we use statistics very lightly in this course. You can spend forever talking about statistics. I've taught 2 separate courses on statistical methods in psychology at 2 very different levels, and you can fill 2 entire courses on the topics and still not cover everything. So when we talk about statistics here, we talk about very sort of abstract concepts. I don't do things like ask you to calculate statistics. What I would do instead is say that we found this particular finding. What does it mean? Or I might show you a correlation when we get to that section and ask you to interpret it. So I don't get you to do calculations here, but we will talk about statistics because they help us draw conclusions. So if I tell you what the outcome of a statistical test was, what conclusion can we draw from it? So I give that little caveat at the beginning because a lot of people see the term statistics and they tend to panic about it because statistics are sort of built up as this really complicated thing. I actually avoided statistics all through high school, all through university. It wasn't until my 5th year of undergraduate course, and I still hated it. But once I started actually doing research and seeing statistics in motion and understanding what we're doing and why, for me that why was that moment where it was like, oh, it's not just useless numbers. We're doing something important. And so I try and lean into that why side of things. We gloss over some of the numbers and lean into the why to give a better understanding of what's going on and hopefully to make statistics just that little bit more accessible, because I do find that they have a bad name for themselves in academia and really don't deserve it. That being said, I try and keep it not too intense because I do enjoy statistics and I don't want to go off on tangents about it, despite having just done it. Okay, so statistics magically happen at that stage. We're waving our hands, and then we're saying once we've drawn our conclusions from our data, once we've evaluated whether there's a difference between the heart rate of the group that saw the advertisement, and the heart rate of the group that saw the control tree image, we can say that maybe there was or was not a difference between the groups. If our hypothesis is being supported, then we would say that there was probably an increase in heart rate for those who saw the experimental image, who saw our advertisement, and the people who saw the tree had a lower heart rate. So there would be a statistically significant difference in the group averages. So we would say that we found a difference, and we can conclude that our advertisement was effective at raising their heart rate. Now we can report the findings. So typically, there are a couple of different ways to report findings, one of which is to actually present your findings at some kind of scientific meeting. So this is when people talk about going to a conference and either giving a talk or presenting a poster. That's presenting their research at that conference. So most conferences, especially scientific conferences, you have to be approved to go. They will take a look at what you're presenting, decide if it matches sort of the scope and the level of the conference that you're at. You can't go and talk about chickadee brains at a human brain conference. You can sometimes go and talk about any kind of brains at generic brain conferences, though. And there are lots and lots of very specific, very niche conferences, and some that are very broad. But it's really interesting to see all of these different areas. That's one way to do it. Another way to report your findings is probably the more common one, and this is actually to publish your findings. So you would go to a journal, specifically a scientific journal, which is peer-reviewed, meaning that other experts within that field would critically evaluate your article before the journal decides if they will accept it or not. So by having experts in that field take a look at what you've done, they can point out any potential flaws. Maybe you missed something. Maybe you didn't control for some really important factor in one of your earlier stages. They might point that out and ask you to redo your experiment or make some adjustments, maybe change your statistics to control for that. So there's really good ways to do that, and that process, by meeting that review process, it ensures that you have fairly high quality articles that are then made available. This is also another one of those, it's a little bit misleading because it's like, oh, you draw your conclusions and then you report it, you publish it, you share it. Not always the case. In the real world, sometimes stuff doesn't go right. Sometimes you report or you find your conclusions at the end and you go, we missed something. Maybe I didn't need the reviewers to tell me that we didn't control for some factor or something went wrong. From experience, we have learned that chickadees will dramatically change their behavior depending on the time of year. So when you run half your birds in the spring and half in the fall, the time of year is actually a lot more important than the experimental group they're in. So that's been problematic. So maybe we'll do a follow-up. This is how you see experiments that have part 2 or study 2 or 3 or 4 all included because you have different iterations where you've controlled for different things. So maybe we run a new batch of birds and we run all of them in the spring. Maybe we want to be really thorough and we run 2 batches of birds, some in the spring and some in the fall. And then we can control across all of those possible sources. So sometimes, instead of going straight from drawing conclusions to reporting them, you will go back a couple of steps and go through the process again. So this isn't necessarily a straight line, despite what it shows in the textbook. That's just one of my pet peeves with this linear path, because it is very rarely linear and leads to some misconceptions. All right, so enough rambling about statistics and methods like that. Next, we're going to move into some of the terms that we're going to need to start talking about doing research. So some of these you've already seen. Some of these we've referred to without outright naming yet. Sometimes I sneak in definitions by giving you lots of synonyms. So these might be something you've already figured out, but I like to list them somewhere very apparent so that you have something to look back on. So the first of our terms is a variable. And a variable is really just an umbrella concept for any characteristic that can vary. So anything that you are measuring or manipulating is a variable. So in our theoretical example of an experiment, whether they saw the advertisement or the tree would be a variable. We could call that variable image exposure or something. And it could be ad versus no ad, or ad versus tree, or whatever you were showing them. There are different levels of that variable. We also had another variable because we were measuring heart rate in our participants. So heart rate is a value that we can measure from those participants, and it can vary. So people can have higher or lower heart rates. Hopefully that variable will change depending on what they observe. So we can talk about variables, and we'll talk again specifically about things like independent and dependent variables when we get into experiments, but it's just sort of a generic term for things that we're measuring or things that we're manipulating. We can also use the term operational definition. And an operational definition is going to define a variable in terms of the specific procedures that are used to either produce or measure, which is a very fancy way of saying that our operational definition is us telling people how we're going to measure, how we're going to quantify any given variable. So I talked about measuring their heart rate as a stand-in for excitement. So excitement is a very abstract concept. You can't really directly measure excitement, and that's common for a lot of psychological ideas. So our conceptual definition there would be excitement. That's the concept that we're talking about. But our operational definition, the definition that we're going to use to actually measure it, is when we said that we're going to measure heart rate as a stand-in for excitement. So we specify that we're specifically going to use, say, a heart rate monitor or a Fitbit or whatever in order to quantify their heart rate. And we're specifying that heart rate is our equivalent or our stand-in for excitement. So with these operational definitions, it's a description in concrete, measurable terms that show people or tell people exactly what you're measuring and how you're measuring. This is really important when reading your research because you can't necessarily understand what someone's conclusions are unless you understand exactly what they were looking at. So if we published a paper and the title says, advertisements increase excitement, that doesn't necessarily mean anything until you look and see that we've measured excitement in terms of heart rate. Like, oh, it makes sense that they would be. Or as a researcher, maybe we want to do a similar study. We want to see if we can replicate or repeat this study in a different population, using a different sample. So maybe instead of just using university students, maybe we want to use older individuals or younger individuals. We want to see if this advertisement is effective in different age groups. So as a researcher, I could read someone's operational definition, which would usually be in their methods, and figure out exactly how they conducted this study so I could do something similar. So these are very important because they tell you exactly what you're doing and how you're doing it. And it can be useful for those who read research, who make research, all sorts of things. The next of our big terms is participants/subjects. And this is one that I've kind of used already because I don't necessarily think of this as a term that needs definition. But participants or subjects can be considered the organisms whose behavior is being observed in our study. So that's who we're doing the research on. Now, the tradition is she'll use participants to refer to humans who are participating in a study. So I can talk about research or undergraduate participants because they are humans participating in a research study. Typically, subjects will refer to any non-human animal who's involved in research. So chickadees would be subjects. Snails would be subjects. Sometimes you'll see people refer to human subjects, but the convention is participants for people. And I just remember that with the P goes with T. And then subjects is everything else. I already kind of covered what's on this slide. So we talked about statistics as sort of a general term that covers things that we're using to analyze data and decide whether our hypothesis is supported or not. And then I mentioned how we can share our findings. So that's that idea of scientific meetings or conferences versus scientific journals. That I didn't really have a great spot to put that, so I just stuck it here, but it fit in earlier. So, all right. So the next couple of slides, we're going to look at 6 of the major types of data collection techniques that you tend to see in psychology. Now, this is basically how we collect our data, how we do our measurements, how we get the stuff that we want to analyze. So these aren't sort of mutually exclusive. Sometimes there's types of measures that kind of overlap with some of these. But for examples, I keep stuff that falls distinctly into one category or another. The first of our data collection techniques is direct observation. So this is when you directly observe people doing something or subjects doing something. So you watch and record their behavior, and you focus on being as objective and as precise as you possibly can. For direct observation, this could be something like going and standing on the side of a road and counting the number of cars that drive by in a specific span of time. You could also use direct observation through something like a video camera or a microphone if you didn't want to be physically present. So even though it implies being in person, that's not necessarily always the case. But direct observation is a pretty simple one where you just watch what's happening or listen to what's happening and record it. We also see a lot of questionnaires in psychology. And questionnaires are a series of written questions designed to obtain information about people's attitudes, opinions, or specific aspects of their behavior. Basically, this is a written bunch of questions that you can ask people, and these questions are formulated in a way that they try and gather information about what people think, what they believe, or how they behave. So you can ask questions targeted towards really anything. You can ask them about what kinds of food they eat, or how much studying they do a day, or how far they commute to work, or whatever you can frame as a question. Some questionnaires will be sort of closed-ended. They'll have, say, multiple choice options. You have to pick on a scale. Some of them are going to be open-ended, where you can write out a response. There's lots of different options there. With interviews, this is kind of like a face-to-face equivalent of questionnaires. So interviews are typically done where a researcher directly asks a question. It implies, again, face-to-face, but you can also conduct an interview, say, over the phone or online if you have a video conference. It's just sort of meant to be questionnaires that aren't written down. So even though it does specify face-to-face, not always. You can also have questions that are done verbally in other methods. And here, again, with interviews, because of the method of delivery, because you're asking people sort of out loud, you typically tend to get a lot more free-form answers. They're not as rigid as, say, a fixed answer questionnaire. So with interviews, you typically have to be a little bit more creative in your interpretation. So maybe you have a scoring guide to determine what kind of answers you got, because as you can imagine, if you ask people, what's your favorite food, people can answer pretty much anything. But maybe you want to look at specific categories, maybe pick a certain subset or something like that. But that's stuff you have to consider if you're doing interview research, which I definitely do not. For more of our data collection techniques, we can look at psychological tests. And these are standardized measures that obtain a sample of subject behavior. So one of the easiest ways to think of psychological tests are standardized tests. So an IQ test would be a psychological test. A personality test would be this. If you've ever taken the Myers-Briggs, where they give you a bunch of letters that qualify with your personality, standardized psychological test. So these are intended to figure some aspect out of behavior. And within psychology, they have made tons and tons of different standardized tests to measure different characteristics that might be of interest. So there are lots that look at, say, your ability to reason and apply logic. There's some for spatial memory, for general intelligence, for emotional intelligence. Again, if you can think of it, there's probably a standardized test for it. That standardized factor is actually really useful. This is sort of a little bit more than you need, but with standardized tests, it's really useful because you can use the same test as someone else. Maybe you want to study personality in university students, and somebody else has studied personality in high school students, and you want to see age difference, or if it differs between different countries or whatever. Because you've used the exact same standardized test, you can compare measures between those populations because your test holds consistent, which is kind of useful, especially where we want to do broader comparisons, which is nice. All right, so the next of these is physiological or neural recording. We've actually already talked about physiological recording. When we talked about measuring heart rate, that is a physiological recording. When you use an instrument to monitor and record some kind of physiological process in a subject. So we can do heart rate is a good one. You can measure the dilation of the pupils because people's eyes react differently to different stimuli. You can measure, another good one is skin conductance. So if you put 2 electrodes on the skin, you can measure how well a current travels across the surface of the skin. The participant doesn't notice it, it doesn't feel like anything, but if you have sort of an increased internal state, you can end up with a little bit more sweat. So if you are afraid or excited, that increase in your body temperature leads to a little bit of perspiration, which registers as higher skin conductance. It's going to move faster, and we can measure that. So you can measure something like excitement or fear by measuring conductivity across the skin, which is kind of cool. On the neural side of things, you can measure anything as specific as an individual neuron. So you can put electrodes on a single cell, and it'll tell you when that cell fires or when it's active. You can look at a larger scale. You can do entire brain scans. You can focus on EEGs, just sort of the surface level, all sorts of different things. But in all of these, we have a different kind of instrument that's both monitoring and recording some kind of process in the body. And the last of our data collection techniques is one that I find often gets left out. And this is the examination of archival records. So this is when you look at existing institutional records. So these records were probably not ever intended to be used for scientific research, but people like writing things down. People like recording and storing things. And psychologists like to co-opt existing data sources as much as possible. So if you've ever heard of the Minnesota twin studies, in Minnesota, they typically keep lots of really good medical records on twins born within the state. Psychologists looked at that and said, oh my gosh, this is perfect. There are individuals, we know that they're twins, we can reach out to them and ask if they want to participate in our studies, but we can look at things like, have they ever been hospitalized for different psychological disorders? We can compare rates of those disorders in twins and see if twins are more likely to both have a disorder than, say, two students are have the same disorder. And if things are more likely to be seen within more closely related people like twins, we might infer that there's a genetic component to that particular trait, which is exactly what they use that database for. There's also things like Greenland, I think, has a fantastic record of psychological institutions. So anyone who's ever been institutionalized for any kind of psychological disorder, they have records of that. And then you compare that to genealogies, because very few people come into or out of the country, and then you can start tracking different disorders through family trees, which is really, really cool. But there's all sorts of different existing records that can be borrowed and put to use for understanding different psychological concepts. And so that's one that's often overlooked because it doesn't necessarily occur to you until you start reading some psychology research. All right, so for the next little bit, we're going to talk about types of research studies. So we have two broad categories that we look at. Typically, when people think about research studies, they automatically think of experiments. And a lot of the examples that we've talked about so far have been pretty experiment heavy. But we will actually start on a different type of research study. We're going to start with the descriptive methods. So descriptive methods are really any means of capturing, reporting, recording, or any other synonym we can think of for describing a group. The distinction here is that experiments focus on manipulating and changing some aspect of the system, whereas descriptive methods are just describing an existing system. So when we talk about descriptive methods, we're not manipulating anything, and that's why they're two separate categories. You'll sometimes see descriptive methods called correlational research, but the two terms aren't a complete overlap. It's a little bit of a technicality, but descriptive methods can include a statement about a single variable. So a descriptive method could be, I want to know how many students at the university have taken intro psychology. So I can look at university records and I can get an absolute number. Or I could get a proportion. I could know that 11% of students tend to take intro psychology. That is a descriptive method, but that's only a single variable. We know one statistic. In order to call something correlational research, we actually have to look at the relationship between two or more variables. So when we talk about a correlation, we're talking about having two variables sort of varying or changing together. And again, we'll talk about correlations specifically on their own, but this is another one of those things where I see it used interchangeably, but they aren't a complete overlap. So you can use descriptive methods to do correlational research, but all descriptive methods don't automatically equal correlational research. So hopefully that distinction is clear. Awesome. All right, so we have 4 different types of descriptive methods that we're going to chat about. And again, these are the ones that are most common within psychology. So the first of these is naturalistic observation. And so as I've kind of made clear, with all of the descriptive methods, they have a couple of things in common. One of which being because they're just describing whatever it is they're looking at, they're measuring and talking about something. They aren't manipulating anything in the system. So naturalistic observation doesn't involve any kind of manipulation, nor do any of our others. Naturalistic observation is when you go into nature and observe an organism in its natural habitat. So you observe how it behaves in its normal place in nature. And because you're going into their space and observing their behavior as they would do it in that space, it's one of the best ways to represent real world behavior. It's most representative of that behavior because you're directly observing it in its natural habitat. When you're conducting naturalistic observation, there are a couple of things you need to keep in mind, and we've already kind of mentioned some of these. Things like reactivity. Humans and other animals tend to react when things come into their environment. So people will change their behavior. Animals will act differently because of your presence. So you can do something like a great example of naturalistic observation and overcoming this problem is Jane Goodall studying apes in their environment. What she would do is go and spend lots of time with them until they acclimatized or got used to her presence. After that acclimatization period, their behavior went back to normal. She was no longer a novel presence. They could go back to ignoring her and behaving normally. So if you're doing naturalistic observation and you're concerned that your presence is changing someone's behavior, if you wait until your presence is no longer something of note, then you can be a little bit more confident that their behavior has gone back to normal. And you can actually measure the reaction to something occurring and then it going back to normal levels, which is kind of cool. One of the things we have to consider here is because we're not manipulating anything, we're not controlling their behavior. Behavior is going to happen as it happens naturally. And that can be problematic if you're trying to do something like study a particular behavior. If you're studying something rare, it's not going to happen very often. And that can mean that you're spending hours and hours or even days or years waiting for that rare event to occur while you're watching. So naturalistic observation can be really time-consuming and data-intensive if you have to sort of scrub through all. We are talking about sort of in-person naturalistic observation. You can also do this with, say, a video camera. You can record things and watch, again, still in the natural environment, so it still counts. It's getting a little bit easier. With naturalistic observation, I guess a good example of this is we record black-capped chickadees. So it's not a video, but it's audio. And when I started, we would manually go through all of our audio recordings and pull out how many vocalizations we got in a time span. Nowadays, there are really fancy programs, and we can teach it what each type of call looks like, and it can pull them out itself, which is phenomenal. So instead of what I used to do and what I did for my degrees, where you spend thousands of hours pulling hundreds of thousands of calls out of files, it just does it for you in the background. You just need enough processing power. So even if you automate it, it's still technically naturalistic observation. And so again, with all of the things that are descriptive, because we're not manipulating anything, because we're not controlling these behaviors, it's going to be very difficult to determine an exact cause of behavior. And so we'll find that we might develop some theories about what might be causing the behavior, but we can't be certain until we perform an experiment. So with experiments, because we're controlling for other factors and we're specifically manipulating things to see if manipulating this event causes that event, so experiments are really the only good way to get causality. So knowing that event A causes event B. For anything that is specifically descriptive, it's very, very hard to get enough evidence to say that there's a causal effect going on. And so we avoid saying that we have causality. We'll stick to there's an association, especially if we can find a correlation between two variables. But yeah, cause is one of those things that's very hard to determine. We can talk about participant observation, which is actually fairly similar to naturalistic observation. But in this case, instead of having the researcher observe the subjects in nature, in this case, the researcher will actually become a participant in effect. So the research will go and join the population of interest. So this is a technique that's used to study, say, clustered groups or isolated groups, things like cults, or maybe people want to study a particular culture. So in participant observation, the researcher would join the cult and observe it as a participant, as a member of that cult. So this allows the researchers to gain insights from the participant's perspective because they themselves have become a participant. But we also have to keep in mind some of the limitations here, which we have lots of overlap with our previous limitations, but here we also need to keep in mind the biases and the interpretations that are made by the researcher. We talked about how each individual has their own experience, and because of what we've experienced, we perceive the world through that own sort of colored lens. So everyone has a bias in what they're interpreting based on what they've come from. So when we look at results or observations that have come out of these kinds of studies, we need to keep in mind who was doing the measuring and what might have colored their interpretation. We also have that issue with observations that are occurring naturally around you, where the observations may not be repeatable, or maybe very rare events that don't occur very often, or maybe the thing that you're waiting to happen doesn't happen ever. So there's all of those limitations. We also can talk about case studies, and this is a huge one for psychology. Case studies are an in-depth report or study focusing on a single person, a group, or a situation. Now, there's a common misconception that case studies only talk about a single person, and that's because in psychology, most of the case studies that we focus on are single individuals. So we talked about last time the patient HM, Henry Molaison, who had part of his brain removed, and how having that hippocampus removed allowed us to study his brain in depth and how that affected his long-term memory, where losing this part of his brain prevented him from forming long-term memory. So that's the typical version of a case study for psychology, where you look at a single individual who has some kind of specific event that happened to them that allows us to learn about some aspect of the brain. Not always the brain, but usually. We can also have case studies that are groups. So maybe you find a particular culture that you want to study, and maybe that culture has never been exposed to other cultures. So by studying that individual group, that is a single case that you're looking at. Or maybe there was a single situation, something very strange happened to a group of people. Maybe you want to look at people who survived a plane crash. So all of those people who went through that same plane crash, that's a single situation. And the reason that we're sort of classifying them as single cases is because it's sort of that one-time thing where it's very rare for this to happen exactly how it happened. These are very useful because they let us collect a lot of detail about odd situations that we may never have had the chance to experience. So someone missing a large portion of their brain is a pretty dramatic thing that we typically wouldn't see. So we can get lots of info about how that has changed and adjusted his functioning. But it's not an experiment. We're not controlling anything. So we have to be careful about what conclusions we can draw. Again, we can't be certain about causal relationships here because we don't have a before and after. In most of these cases, we see these people after something has happened and only after. So case studies are an N of 1 where you're only really sampling a single instance or a single case. So you just have to be careful with your conclusions. And I only have one more slide, but I think I am going to stop there because I tend to wander about surveys. But we'll finish surveys in the next class and then start into experiments. But I will leave you guys there and then we can chat on Friday.